Hello, everybody. Welcome to our next webinar. It's our great pleasure again to be here with you. This one I think is particularly exciting and of interest to everybody that drinks ayahuasca, wants to research ayahuasca, is interested in knowing more about ayahuasca. The title of our webinar today is Duty of Care, Reflections on Ceremonial Best Practices. So before we get into the webinar in itself, I'd like to share a few words about what is the ADF, the Ayahuasca Defense Fund. The Ayahuasca Defense Fund is a program of the ICEERS Foundation, and we are a recent initiative. We are still a small team. We're basically running on donations, and we're starting a work that planting seeds that we hope that will generate many positive outcomes in the future. So let me just share you a little bit about what we do. We have three dimensions to the ADF. One is the more obvious one, which is legal counseling. So we help people that have been arrested or prosecuted or have some kind of legal challenge with ayahuasca, either more direct or indirect. We have a website, ayahuascadefense.com, and in this website you can find the eligibility criteria to receive the support of the ADF. The second dimension of what the ADF do has to do with education and prevention. So teaching people about different aspects of legislation, of ayahuasca best practices. In one line, the idea is better that it is best to prevent and to take care and to be well informed than to have legal problems afterwards. So in a large understanding, this webinar fits into this category of the activities of the ADF. The other dimension of the ADF is advocacy on legal reform. And of course, we all know that the current drug war and the current legislation that classifies drugs between licit and illicit has no scientific foundation and brings more harms than the use of substances itself. So we advocate to influence policymakers and change global perception on the benefits of psychedelics or plant medicines, ethnobotanicals, more particularly ayahuasca, but not only. And today we have a webinar about best practices where members of ICEERS will be sharing with you guidelines and protocols on ayahuasca best practices. In one line, the idea is how can we maximize the benefits of the experience and how can we minimize the risks? So this involves reflections on harm reduction, but also things like screening, processing or integration, certain behaviors that are recommended or not during ceremonies, the role of diets, the training of the leaders and the facilitators. Then again, one might ask, what does this have to do with legality and why is the ADF involved in this? And here I point again that we have a larger understanding about the role of best practices. Of course, if you conduct ceremonies in a poor way, or if you don't have proper care for the participants, if the facilitators don't have proper training, most likely you will get involved in accidents and unfortunate situations. So the idea here is to cultivate a series of understandings and to exchange and share knowledge about these things. In a larger way, the ADF is also just trying to convey conversations that are needed on the global expansion of ayahuasca, conversations that sometimes are not happening, and that conversations that are important to have in this context of the incredible boom in interest in use of ayahuasca. So that was my general presentation about our webinar today. I'm very happy to introduce our next speakers because they are both very knowledgeable and sweet people, and they are also partners and friends and allies that have been doing an amazing work and that we are grateful for their dedication, their life commitment, their integrity in doing what they do. The first one is Jerónimo Mazarassa. He is at the executive office of ICEERS, and he's a writer and independent researcher. He has worked on a few films about ayahuasca. That is his formal bio, but his informal bio is that Jero has been around the block. He has drinking and visited ayahuasca ceremonies all across the Americas and Europe for more than a decade. So he's in a unique position of having seen firsthand different styles and different practices of ayahuasca used in different contexts. And he's also a storyteller, and although he's young, I consider he has a lot of wisdom. And so he also plays on different fields. He has done he runs a blog that follows the ayahuasca movement. He has had a strong presence in the internet, and he's part of the steering committee of the Ayahuasca Defense Fund. And the next participant is Marc Aixalà. He's Catalan, and he coordinates the integration and support service of ICEERS. So Marc is behind the very touchy hotline of ICEERS. Basically, he has been a big ears to hear all the kinds of problems that happen in the ayahuasca world. So much like a lawyer that deals with divorce, he is and can have a unique perspective on love or marriage. He deals with ayahuasca-related problems and can have a unique and special perspective on the practice of drinking ayahuasca, because he has heard innumerous stories of problems, failures, frustrations, and he has helped guide these people through. So it's a beautiful work. It's a work from his heart, and it's also a free work. ICEERS doesn't charge anything for this service. He can tell you a little bit more on how to access the service. And here he was challenged to translate this empirical experience into a set of guidelines. So I want to thank both of our participants in advance for their time and their willingness to take the challenge to address a topic that is big and that has many different entrances. And without further ado, I'd like to pass the word to Jero.
Thank you, Bia, for that nice introduction. Give me just 1 second. I have to start a number of devices, and I just need to bring up my presentation up. Okay, here you go. Okay, thank you, Bia. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Today, I am going to be talking about best practices as seen through a very peculiar lens, which is as seen through the lens of traditions, of ayahuasca traditions, both indigenous and religious. So the background question to it is sort of, okay, what can we learn about best practices from these traditions? The reason why I am talking about this, or the reason why I came to have opinions about this, it's because, as Bia said, sometime like 15 years ago, I started working on a documentary project about ayahuasca, and at this point, I'm not ashamed to say I didn't know anything about ayahuasca. We didn't know anything about ayahuasca. Just a few things we read, and we knew so little that we actually thought that it would be possible to make a sort of a family picture of the world of ayahuasca, that we could make a film that would be like a family album of all the different manifestations around ayahuasca. So, you know, the churches, the different churches, the different indigenous groups, and we wanted to sort of make a film where you could see everybody. And, you know, like I said, we were young and ignorant. We set off on this quest, and that it took us a number of years to realize that it was going to be impossible, that there was simply that the world of ayahuasca, just the traditional world of ayahuasca, was too rich. There was too much variety. There was too many manifestations to fit in one film, in 10 films, or maybe in 20 films. The good thing, or the positive thing that came out of it, is that until we came to this conclusion, we were really quite determined to get all of these things in. So we went, and like Bia said, we visited many different, we actually tried to visit everyone we heard of. We visited many different groups, many different manifestations. We spent time with them, we interviewed them, we filmed their processes, we drank ayahuasca with them, you know, and in the process we were trying to, you know, see what story we could tell about them, how they felt about ayahuasca, how they work with it, what was different. So the net result of this is that I was indeed, we were exposed to really a very wide variety of what is a very wide spectrum of uses around ayahuasca, even when you stay within the tradition. So this is how I came to, sort of collect these stories, and I'll share some of them with you about, the traditional use of ayahuasca. I must say at this point, when we started, 15 years ago, when this was a lot less well known, and especially for myself, one thing that really jumped at me was this idea of sort of an accumulated wisdom, an accumulated expertise. This is what I seem to be finding everywhere I went. And this, it made me think a lot, not just of indigenous people. I think the way the Mediterranean cultures make wine and grow the wine grapes, or the way all of us ride bicycles, or the way all of us drive cars. These are all examples also of sort of this accumulated wisdom or accumulated expertise. This is something that is the result of many years of collective trial and error, and it builds into a sort of system of rules that serves to sort of minimize the problems and maximize the benefits. You think about how many things had to happen before the entire way we drive cars came into place. The way the handle, where the steering wheel is, where the brake is, where the accelerator is, where the gear is, where the lines are painted on the road, and the driver's license and the signs on the road. All of these systems were developed throughout hundreds of years to come to a place where indeed people can drive cars. Many people can drive cars very fast on these roads, and of course accidents do happen, but we can say that we've greatly minimized. We've done it as efficient as possible. Now, this is what I mean sort of by accumulated expertise or accumulated wisdom. And this is the lens through which I'm going to approach, and I'm going to look at tradition in this particular talk. Now, this is a very limited lens, and it's a very limiting lens. Traditions are much more than best practices. Traditions are art, their culture, their human feeling, their cosmologies, their mythologies, their incredible richness. But for this talk, in concrete, I'm just going to be focused on this, this very limited aspect of tradition. So basically, I was looking at the, I spent a number of years looking at the way people who had been using ayahuasca for a long time were using ayahuasca. And this for me was very interesting because I came from a culture that, might have, in the long past, have a relationship with substances similar to ayahuasca. It's up for people, there's disagreement of this. But in any case, what we do know is that, my culture, Western European culture, has not had a relationship with substances like ayahuasca for a very long time, or maybe never at all. So that means we had no points of reference in regards with these substances. And when people have no points of reference, they tend towards experimentation. They just try different things to see what happens. So, if I gave you a book and you didn't know what a book is, you might think that it's good for sitting on, or you might think that it's something that you can use to keep the door open, or you might think that a book is a very useful thing to make fire. And this is what I mean by experimentation that comes, from when something is completely new. You don't know how to approach these things. Now, to give you an example, a personal story, the first time that I took a plant teacher, was or a power plant in an indigenous context was almost 20 years ago. It was in the mountains of Oaxaca, and I took Ololuiki seeds with this indigenous shaman. And I was very, very excited because I had read a lot about this, and I had, studied this and all of this, but actually I never experienced this. I'd never actually been with an indigenous shaman or healer taking these substances. So, it was all very exciting. So we were taken to this room, and we took the seeds, we drank the seeds, and then, the sort of ceremony began. It was only 3 of us. And the old man kept turning to me and asking me, did it grab you already? Are you feeling the effects? And then finally, when I said yes, he said, okay, very well. Now it's your turn. You have to speak, and you have to speak out loud, and you have to ask God, what is it that you want him, what is it that you want God to give you? And this question really triggered in my head a long chain of very confusing. I mean, I entered in a state of total confusion. I won't go into detail yet. I would just say that it became clear, and I spent a long time of the night thinking the experience, you could say the drug experience, the psychedelic experience that I was experiencing that night was not entirely unknown to me. It wasn't new. I had experimented with this with my friends in Europe, in the United States. I was familiar with this experience, but I had never ever actually considered that you could use this experience to actually think about what it was that you wanted God to give you in your life. No, this is what I mean about what you do with a book when you don't know that a book is, or what are the different possible uses that comes out of things. It triggered, and the question is, the question that I came was like, if you give a book to a person that has never seen a book, how long is it going to take before they figure out the best possible use, or if you give a car to someone who's never driven. Now, I don't have an answer to that, but what I can say is that from that point, really from that night, I became very, very interested in traditional use, in how it worked, because for me it became sort of a reference point. Just like if you decided to make wine from scratch, you might be, well advised to look at the way, Mediterranean, French, Spanish, Italian, Greek people have been growing and making wine. Suddenly I realized that what I was looking at is like, here's what people who have been using these plants for much longer than ourselves do with them, and here's the technique they've developed. And indeed, here's a whole set of rules that sort of maximize benefits and minimize dangers. So today I would like to talk about just two examples. For example, just two examples that I picked, that I found, that I've thought about, and that I thought, I found particularly enlightening or clarifying throughout the years. The first one has to do with the dieta, the concept of dieta. Now, the concept of dieta gets confusing because there's a double concept. There's, of course, the dieta that is a sort of isolation retreat that happens in a cabin in the middle of the jungle, where a person spends a long time in isolation, taking dieta plants. That's not the dieta that's a fascinating dieta, but it's not the dieta that I'm going to be talking about today. What I'm going to be talking about is the dieta that happens before you drink ayahuasca. So, as you know, depending where you go, when we went out, we found that wherever we went, everybody agreed that, a few days, and the number of days changed, before you drink ayahuasca, and a few days after you drink ayahuasca, there was a number of things that you couldn't do. There was a diet that you had to keep. And this was sort of pretty universal, I would say, in terms of the traditions. There was an idea everywhere that certain things, certain practices, certain foods, a wide variety of things were contrary to ayahuasca, or they should be avoided near the use of ayahuasca. This was pretty much everywhere. What wasn't everywhere, where things got, sort of confusing, was that from one place to another, the list of things that you had to avoid changed. So in some places, people told me that, you absolutely shouldn't eat pork. Other places, people said you absolutely couldn't have sex, or salt, or sugar. You couldn't have papaya. In other places, you could have papaya. In some places, you couldn't have fruits. Other places, you couldn't have beans. I mean, the lists changed from place to place and from tradition to tradition. It was not universal, and I must say this is something that I don't see it so much nowadays. But it seemed like in the early 2000s that there were endless discussions about these topics in conferences and things like this having to do with ayahuasca. So here's the situation. We have a series of traditions, and they all agree that some sort of restrictions should happen. Some things should be avoided before drinking ayahuasca, but you can't really find a universal elements that should be avoided. I would say, perhaps, Spicy foods pops out a lot. Pork is something that pops out a lot too. You know, and alcohol, it depends, it changes from place to place. I've seen, for example, very traditional Colombian taitas wash out their ayahuasca drink with a shot of aguardiente, which is a green liquor. So, is there a lesson here? No, is there a best practice here? Is there something that can be learned that is useful for us? You know, I think, and this is just, you know, my personal thought, my personal elaboration after, you know, many years of looking at this and thinking about this, that I think very often people get this thing with the dietas wrong because they believe that the dieta is a sort of counterindication. Like, for example, like, you know, you cannot mix Valium with alcohol. That's a counterindication because they potentiate each other. So people think that, you know, if the rule says that you cannot eat pork before having ayahuasca, and then you eat pork and you have ayahuasca and nothing happens, the rule is wrong. But I think that's not the case. I think that's mistaken. These are not counterindications. They're safety rules. That would be like saying, you know, I went driving my car and I didn't put on my seatbelt and nothing happened to me. So why should I put on my seatbelt? You know, there's a difference between safety rules and counterindications. And I think that a lot of these things that come around the dietas are actually safety rules. And the other is that I think the deeper wisdom, the deeper lesson that lies around this counterindication, it doesn't have to do so much with the objects themselves, the types of foods or situations to be avoided, but with a sort of wider, deeper understanding that says the following: you are about to embark in a very powerful, very special experience, because ayahuasca can be like this, a very significant experience, also a very tiring experience, and a very important experience. And the question is, how are you going to wrap this experience? And now people would say, well, what does it matter, the wrapping? I mean, what is the difference if I give you a ring and I give you a ring in a beautiful box in a beautiful wrapping? Well, in terms of, you know, I guess if we're going to be deeply logical, there is no difference between the two. But the thing is, human beings, we're not deeply logical, no? We live in a world that is not just made of atoms, you know, and physical reality, but it's also made of signs, it's made of symbols, it's made of gestures, it's made of intentions, you know, and it's made of words. And we humans are living in this world and we are affected by this. And that's why when you wrap a gift on a beautiful piece of paper, that gift is somehow better, because now the experience involves not just getting the thing, but a sort of process of opening. I don't know. I mean, we could go about this forever. We just know that gifts are wrapped because they're somehow better when they're wrapped. They become more special. The wrapping, it's a way of showing that what it's inside is special. And what happens in ayahuasca session, I believe, is also special. And to actually make the mental effort, a gesture of saying, because this thing special is happening 3 days from now, I'm not going to do these things. It's a sort of, it acts as sort of a wrapper, a protection. It's a symbol, it's a gesture, it's an intention, it's a set of words, and all of these things feed into the experience, you know, contain the experience and make it better. Because this is really the key. I believe one of the keys with ayahuasca, when you with the ayahuasca experience, is really how you hold the experience, not so much experience itself, but how you hold the experience after it's done. And I think the dietas contribute to this. I will give you another example, and that has to do with proselytism, with the way groups work. Now, right now, the question would be something like, what should ayahuasca drinkers do about other people who do not know ayahuasca? Now, for us, for most of us, this is a recent thing. For most Westerners, we've been drinking ayahuasca 10, 15, 20 years, some of us, but you know, it's relatively recent. So we've only had to deal with the situation for a few years, but in places like Acre in Brazil, you know, which is the cradle of the ayahuasca religions. Some people have been dealing with this, with the fact that you drink ayahuasca but your neighbors don't, for more than 3 generations. So how do they deal with this? What is the accumulated wisdom, for example, of the Santo Daime or of these religions? What is their tradition around this idea? How do you deal with other people, with your neighbors who don't drink ayahuasca? I think there's 2 things I like very much about the Santo Daime. One is a saying that they often say, and they say it's translated as something like, the Daime is for everybody, but not everybody is for the Daime. And that is something that is sort of a saying that is being said, and that contains that certain wisdom as well, which means that indeed this experience, of course, would potentially be for everybody, but actually somehow it is not. And the other is that there is a rule which I thought was really interesting, especially in our religion, which is you're in the Santo Daime, you're not allowed to invite other people to come drink ayahuasca with you. Now, that doesn't mean they're not open. The doors of the temple are always open. Anybody pretty much can walk into a Daime temple ceremony and ask to participate, and you know, after some questions and some skilling, they will be welcomed in. So the doors are open. However, the members of the church are not allowed to go to their neighbors and say, I drank ayahuasca and it did me really good and I think you should try it. I mean, they're allowed to say, I drank ayahuasca and it did me really good. They're not allowed to say, and I think you should try it. In this way, they become completely separate from almost all other, certainly Judeo-Christian, I mean, not Judeo, but certainly other like Christian, Muslim traditions where proselytism is an active part of it. Here's a religion that explicitly forbids people from inviting others to join. Now, there is, and some people have argued that this has to do with certain political situation in Acre, where this took place, and this is sort of a precautionary method. But which happened in the 60s and 70s, as this religion was in a sort of shifty state, in an unclear state with the authorities. But I think again that there's a deeper wisdom in this consideration, and it has to do with the fact that the ayahuasca experience is potentially so life-changing. It can be so groundbreaking. It can have such an effect on people's life that it can only come from the person itself. That nobody should take upon themselves the responsibility of telling others, that this is something that they should try or they should do. I think there's a very deep wisdom there. I heard someone say once that the main counterindication of ayahuasca is not wanting to drink ayahuasca. So that you should never drink ayahuasca if you don't want to drink ayahuasca, because it's going to be horrible. No? The role of consent in ayahuasca is huge, and that's why this question is so important. But to me, this is another example of how how inspiring some of the practices of traditions that come from the traditions can be when looking about how to work with this. Another good example I think comes from groups that I know that work in Europe, and they come from the Peruvian vegetalista traditions. They're Europeans, but they learn in Peru for many years, and now they're running sessions in Europe and all over the world. And they have the same issues. How should they grow? How should the newcomers join the group? The way they have done it is through sponsorship. Sponsorship means that if someone wants to join the group, the circle that already exists, one person in the circle has to be that person's sponsor. So the sponsor, you cannot come if you don't have a sponsor. And this sponsor is not just the person who introduces you to the group, but this sponsor becomes responsible for the person that has come in. That is, they will help with the follow-up, they will make sure they're doing okay, they will continue staying in touch with the person after the experience. Why this is what the beautiful thing about this system is that one, it makes for a very organic growth of the groups. They grow through people that know each other, and two, it involves the entire group in sort of keeping track of each other. Why do I think that this is necessary? Because it is a new context. In a traditional context, people very often knew each other much better. They lived in communities, they could keep tabbing each other, they see how each other was doing, they could hear through the neighbors, they could hear through gossip. But in our modern urban societies, even when the ritual, as in this case, is purely traditional, the context is not. So people are likely to arrive through many channels. Maybe after the sessions, they will not see each other again. So a new sort of best practice develops or arises out of the challenges that the Western urban context is placing on the material. What are some of these new challenges that happen when ayahuasca goes out of the traditional context? I think a lot of it, I'm just going to focus on one aspect. Again, there's much could be said about this, but I think there is an important group of them has to do with the fact that the community aspect is lost. What happens when you take ayahuasca out of a small community, which is what happens in a lot of the urban, Western context? Well, for one thing, it's much harder to tell good practitioners from bad practitioners. In the traditional context, everybody knew who had a good reputation and who didn't, who cured well and who didn't cure so well. Everybody knew who had 3 decades of experience and who only had 3 years. But as we go away from those communities of origin, this is much harder to tell. And the same goes also for not just the practitioners, the providers, but for the drinkers. In a community environment, people usually know the neighbors. They know their story, and they know their family, they know their particularities, they know their problems, they know their previous history. And the community also sort of knew how the brew affected these people, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 7 weeks after drinking. If a person was having problems, as we say now, integrating, this would be known by the community. These are some examples of the things that are lost, when ayahuasca has traveled out of the, more, rural traditional context and into urban contexts. Also, the roles are changing. Until 10 years ago, indigenous healers or curanderos, they never had to really be responsible for the healing of 30 to 40 white people all at once who are drinking many times in just 2 weeks and having huge breakdowns on their living. This is also, even though it still happens within a traditional structure, the context is changed, and it keeps changing. I believe it's because reasons like these, because of this new context and because these new necessities that arise, that we're also beginning to see the rise, the emergence of new sets of best practices. So, Marc, who's going to speak now and who is the main psychologist who's working on ICER's emergency hotline, and who therefore gets to see a lot of what happens when things do not work well, that's the second half of this talk. Marc is going to talk exactly about some best practices that are developing, around the use of ayahuasca and other entheogens in an urban Western context. So thank you very much. I'm going to put you, Bia, back in, and thank you very much. Oops, 1 second, sorry. Is this one. There you go.
Hello, Pedro. Thank you for your presentation. I think you touched a topic that is kind of in the central nervous system of anthropology, which is that old discussion about culture versus nature. What is exactly cultural and what is natural? Where does one start and where does the other finishes? So are the diets, are the rules because they have a biological meaning and they're really efficient and true, or is this a symbol? And people build these things in order to have kind of symbolic feelings around it. And I like your answer, which is a little bit, it's both. It has some probably grounds to it in terms of safety, but it also has a symbolic aspect. I just like to say that as an anthropologist, I would add that a lot of the traditional rules have to do with specific things of the cosmologies involved. But anyway, that is a long discussion that we can't have right now. Maybe we can pick up in the questions and answers. I forgot to tell everybody that, in the beginning that we will take questions and answers. What we do here is we use the button Q&A on the bottom of your screen. We are not using the chat. So after Marc, we're going to have a chance to have questions for both speakers. And now we're all looking forward to hearing from Marc. Please go ahead, Marc.
Hello. Thank you very much, Bia, for the introduction and Jero for your talk. and hello to all the people who I cannot see, but I know that you're there. I'm gonna start playing the anthropologist with the permission of my anthropologist friends, my beloved anthropologist friends, and I think it's one of the key issues of what we're going to be talking about is this mixture of contexts that we find. That in a way, ayahuasca is always used in a kind of traditional context, but it's not the traditional context that was originally designed. So even if we Westerners, we go to the Amazon to have an ayahuasca experience, that context has shifted from what it was originally. And I think that what Jero was saying is really, really important. These best practices that we are talking about, they need to be developed because of this change in the context, not because they are needed in the original context. A lot of what I'm going to be talking about is from a psychological and Western perspective, and it doesn't directly apply to the original traditions and the shamanic traditions and the church, Santo Daime, UDB. It doesn't apply to that because we're not talking about the same thing. But since what we see the most is a mixture of this context in which people go to the jungle to have a traditional experience and then they come back to Barcelona or whatever, these new best practices apply. I don't really like the word of best practices because if we have best practices, that implies that there are good practices and bad practices. What I'm more concerned about is safe practices. So in my daily work, what I usually see is people that have had challenging experiences with ayahuasca or other psychedelic substances, and then I've been able to see some things that are common in these kind of cases that have happened during the experience, before the experience, or after the experience. So this is the framework in which I'm going to be talking from. I'm going to share a keynote presentation. Let's see if I can do it properly. Okay, so you should be seeing this presentation now. Okay, so some of you might have seen this over and over. Every time that I talk, I say the same thing, but I believe it's kind of important. When we talk about drinking ayahuasca, most of the times we only think about the session itself. But as Jero was saying before, the wrapping is really, really important. So, and it has an impact on how the experience develops. So I like to see the ayahuasca intake as a whole process, you know. So before the session, there are going to be things happening. During the session, things are going to be happening, and afterwards also. And I'm trained as an engineer, so I like to divide things into smaller problems so I can understand them better. And the way that I understand the process is this, you know. So before the session, we have an integration, preparation, sorry. Then we have the session in which we take the ayahuasca, and then we have the integration. And maybe after we will have a psychotherapeutic process. So and this can be a little bit confusing because sometimes during the session, or mostly during the retreat or the workshop, there will be a part that is called preparation, there will be the session itself, and there will be an integration. But I think that it's important to have like a wider perspective of this thing. So the preparation that we do during the workshop or the ceremony is not the only preparation that needs to be done as this big wrapping. And the integration that usually happens during the workshops, it's not all the integration that is going to happen after the experience. So I think it's important to widen the concept of what happens. You know, as Jero said, an ayahuasca experience can be life-changing. So it's not going to be a matter of 4 hours or 6 hours or a whole night. It's going to be more a thing of a process that can take weeks or can take months. So then I'm going to be talking about these different parts. And another thing that I like to compare it with is like a regular medical procedure. If you have, let's say, a broken leg or something like that needs surgery, first you go see the doctor, and the doctor that sees you is not the same doctor that is going to perform the actual surgery. And it's not the same doctor that is going to be afterwards for the recovery. All right. So when you have to do this physiotherapy, it's going to be someone else. But sometimes in the ayahuasca world, we think that the same person needs to do everything. And sometimes ayahuasca providers, especially Westerner ayahuasca providers, they think that they need to know how to do the preparation. They need to know how to be good shamans. They need to be good integration therapists, and they need to be psychotherapists. And if we play of having all these hats, maybe there's something that we cannot do it well. That's why we have this specialized society in which we are good in certain things and we're not so good in other things. So I think that it's important to keep this big paradigm in mind. Okay, so when we talk about preparation, I like to have like these three ideas of what means preparation. One of the things that is really important is the screening procedures. How are you going to screen people that are going to come to a workshop, or who is someone that is in a moment that ayahuasca can be safe or beneficial for them, and who is at risk when using ayahuasca? This is important. So the screening process is something that when doesn't happen, it increases the risks. And many of the cases that come to the ISER support service is people that they have not been screened, and if they had, maybe they would haven't used ayahuasca. So it is important, it's a prevention part of the process. Another part is preparing the participants. It doesn't mean that because someone has a fantastic health and no psychological problems and everything is all right, they are ready to drink ayahuasca. Sometimes a lot of the problems that happen in the sessions and afterwards is because the participants, they don't know what to expect about the effects of ayahuasca. They don't know what to expect about interactions during the workshop. They don't know what to expect in terms of the cosmology that's going to be used in that framework. They don't know what is going to happen. And then if you don't know what's going to happen, even the most fantastic experience as a ego dissolution can be perceived like going mad or dying. And if you don't have this framework that this is something that can actually happen, you can run into problems because you don't know what you're stepping into. So I think it's extremely important that people know where they are going to, Of course, they will not know what will happen in the experience, but they need to have a framework. They need to have a cartography of the kind of experiences that can happen. I think that this is an extremely important part of the preparation. And sometimes we assume that people already know this. And this could have been true, 15, 20, 40 years ago. If you wanted to drink ayahuasca 40 years ago, you should really know a lot, to begin with, to find ayahuasca. But nowadays, ayahuasca is on the internet, so you don't really need to be really knowledgeable about ayahuasca to find ayahuasca. So it's important to prepare people also in this theoretical understanding of what is going to happen during the workshop, what kind of effects can ayahuasca have, and what is going to be happening in terms of relationships during the ceremony of the workshop. And then there's the preparation of the setting, which can sound very basic, but sometimes problems happen because of this, because the place in which people are doing ayahuasca is not the most comfortable place to do it, and they are lacking water, food, toilets. They don't have enough sitters. They don't have a communication device to talk with the hospital in case of emergency. So this is something that needs to be prepared beforehand. So all this happens weeks before the session itself. What about the screening procedures? I get a lot of questions regarding screening procedures, and it's a challenging issue because in order to do a really good screening, one cannot do a beautiful workshop. You cannot fill the workshop with 1 hour of filling questionnaires and interviewing people in a clinical way. That doesn't work. So one has to find a compromise between the beautiful wrapping of the ceremony and also a good screening. What it's important to screen is, in my opinion, or for what I've seen, is these three big categories. The physical health, of course, you want to check if they are taking medication, if they have any specific illness, especially if they have epilepsy or if they had a cardiovascular condition, and if they are pregnant. This is something that you want to know. And some people don't know that they can be pregnant, but it can be also interesting to ask, well, you don't know if you are, but could you be pregnant? Is there the possibility that that's the case? So physical health, then the psychological health, which is what most of us think directly when we think about screening. There are some categories of this, and I will talk about this a little bit more. But then another aspect that usually is forgotten is the social situation of the person. As Jero was saying before, and this is something that we've talked a lot in previous discussions, in the shamanic traditions or in Santo Daime or UDV traditions, these things of preparation and integration is not so strict, but for a reason, because these kind of experiences, they are already integrated in the cosmology of the context that they work in. So if you have an experience, you can go to your neighbor and you can talk about the experience, and that doesn't need to be integrated because that's already part of the cosmology that you live in. But this is not our case. We go to a very strange environment such as the jungle. We have a 7-day or 10-day retreat in which we drink 7 days ayahuasca, and then you come back to a city of 2 million people, you know. So that's a shift in the context. And if when you go back home, you don't have a support network that can work as a support network, this is one of the factors that can have a huge influence on how you integrate or how you handle challenging experiences after they happen. So it is important to screen for the work situation, the living situation, the family relationships. If, I don't know, what is going on in the life of this person. It's good to have an idea of that. And then another thing that it's sometimes misunderstood is that I've heard this many times. Someone having, let's say, a psychotic break during an experience, and then the person leading the experience saying, no, but this person had come 5 times or 10 times and he or she didn't have any problem, you know. So that's why I didn't ask anything before the session. Okay, the screening needs to be done every single time, because as it's obvious that our lives change, you know, our living situations, they change. We develop illnesses, we go into anxiety, depression, we face challenges in our life. So the screening is something that it's not you do it once and then it's done forever. It's more like the screening is, am I now in a moment in which ayahuasca can be beneficial for me? You know, so this is also something that needs to be thought every time. So the context, the social context sometimes is forgotten, but it's very, very important. In terms of psychological health, what we all fear is that someone has a psychotic break. This is a Western nomenclature, but name, but it's okay. Psychotic break. This is, I think we can understand what we mean by that. And it's difficult to predict who can have such kind of experience, but the screening should try to avoid this happening. So one thing that it's important to check is the clinical history of the person. Does the person had severe depression or anxiety, or do they have a bipolar disorder, or they have had suicidal attempts or any previous psychotic experience? This doesn't mean that these people cannot drink ayahuasca. You will decide. If you're a provider, you decide what you do, you know, but it's good to know, all right? The second thing, it's also important to know if people have had challenging experiences with ayahuasca before. You know, some people have had tremendously difficult ayahuasca experiences, and they go again to have another experience, and it can happen and they go back to the experience. So it's important to be a little bit aware of this. And this is not easy, because sometimes you have people coming for the first time, and what will you do? You're going to start asking about the traumas that they've had in their life. Have you been sexually abused? I mean, that's not professional at all, you know. So one needs a little bit of a clinical experience in order to, I don't know, have a feeling of the person, establish a good relationship, a good bond with the person, and explore a little bit what challenges might happen in an experience. People with personality disorders, it's okay, it's not a problem, but it makes things a little bit more difficult in terms of relationships. So it's good to know if you're going to have a participant that maybe is going to be a little bit more challenging to deal with than the other, if he gets angry or whatever. And the fourth thing is what, after very intensive research, Jose Carlos Bouso and myself, we read a lot of papers, and the only predictor of psychosis that we found consistent in many papers is this aspect that they call social anedonia. People that they don't enjoy social relationships, people that tend to isolation, people that they rather be alone than be with someone else, you know, this kind of life, very solitary life, but kind of avoiding social relationships. This social anedonia seems to predict chances of going into psychotic episodes later in life. You know, it's not a cause-effect thing, but that's why it's important to check the context, the social context of the person. and also the coping strategies. How it's a good idea to know how someone deals with stressful experiences. So if an ayahuasca is a potentially stressful experience, so how is this person going to deal with it? Does he have a support network? Is he going to try to solve the problem in a rational way? He's going to have an emotional outbreak. And so you can ask, have you had any challenging experience in a stressful situation? How do you respond? What do you do in this situation? This is a protocol we designed with Jose Carlos Bouso, and this is very clinical. I mean, you would never do that in any kind of workshop, you know. But the idea is that we have like 3 phases. One phase in which you get the medical information of the person, so you can pay attention to that, have a look, study that a little bit. And then a second part, very important, an interview, in which you review the medical form and you get to talk about the person, you know the person, and you see how's the social context, you get the general impression of how this person is. And then you decide, you know, if you think that this person, I'm aware that I'm talking all the time as I was talking to providers, you know, but this can also be seen as a participant. If I go to drink ayahuasca in a place, if they do this kind of stuff, they are doing safe practices, you know. So it's also a way of, from an ayahuasca user to screen a center in a way, you know. So I explain it this way because it's easier for me, but it's a 2-way kind of screening. And another thing that is important here is that you decide if the person can drink ayahuasca or not. And then you need to tell the person. And I think what is really, really important here is to make it about ayahuasca, not about the person. It's like, it's not that you're not suitable to drink ayahuasca, it's that at this moment of your life, ayahuasca might not be the good tool for you at this moment, you know. So, because otherwise we're going again into the medical kind of setting of this is pathological, you are weak, you are ill, you're whatever, you cannot drink ayahuasca because you are a mess, you know. And that's going back to labeling and stigmatizing. All right. I think I've talked a little bit about this, you know, about the paradigm, the cartography, the kind of experiences, about how to prepare the participants. Then we go into the second part, the ceremony. And in the ceremony, you will intervene, or they will intervene depending to the tradition. If you're in Santo Daime and you're doing an hymnario, they're going to be singing an hymnario. If you're in a Peruvian context with a shaman, it's going to be dark at night with singing the Icaros, and all that is okay, you know. So this is this kind of interventions. But what about the emergency interventions? If something goes wrong, what are you going to do? You know, it's important to have a plan, to develop a emergency interventions plan just in case things go wrong. I always make this joke that pouring ayahuasca is easy, you know. I mean, you just need to pour the ayahuasca in a cup, serve it to the person. And if everything goes okay, that is okay. But if something goes wrong, then it's when things, when it shows the expertise that someone has, you know. So what situations can become an emergency? This all comes from reports that we've had at the support service. So it's not me making up what can happen, but the most powerful experiences and challenging experiences that we've seen, they fall into these categories, like really frightening experiences, I don't know, reliving a trauma, or becoming very aggressive and trying to fight against the other people in the workshop, getting paranoid and wanting to leave the workshop, having what in the ayahuasca tradition is understood as possession of an entity, and then all of the things above can happen, or having seizures during an ayahuasca experience, or someone that goes into a physical emergency, or something that looks like an emergency, a physical emergency, and how will you know if it's a physical or it's a psychological emergency? It's important to be able to discriminate that. So the way that I've learned to deal with emergency situations is mostly based in the harm reduction approach that we developed at the Cosmic Care Interventions at Boom Festival, which is a similar thing to Zendo. And this might not look very spiritual in a way or related to the ayahuasca community, but it is, in the way that in such events, the kind of emergencies, they can be really, really different. So you get to see people with LSD, MDMA, also ayahuasca, you know. So, and then it's like it doesn't really matter the paradigm that you're working in. It's more like a practical approach. How to contain someone that is violent. How to discern if it's a medical emergency or if it's a psychological emergency. What is medication indicated in this case, like the use of Valium, something like that, to decrease the anxiety and allow the person to continue going through the experience, but with less anxiety. All these kind of things are interesting, and I think that they are kind of well developed in the framework of Cosmic Care and Zendo. So I believe that that's a good place to learn this kind of emergency interventions. And finally, integrations, which is the trendy subject right now. We've always talked about integration, but I have the feeling that I don't know if we knew what we meant by integration. So again, I like to divide it into different categories. I think there are two kinds of integrations. One, when everything goes okay, it's like, what do we do so this experience is useful for us when we go back to our lives? And another kind of integration is, what do we do with the undesired effects? You know, if the experience has been really frightening, and after the experience we are having all kinds of symptoms, what do we do in that situation? And the approaches are completely different. So as you will see, the interventions in integration that appear in this slide, and they are mostly the kind of activities that happen during a ceremony, after the ceremony, I mean, but during the workshop. Yeah, you do a sharing group, you do a mandala drawing, you do any kind of artistic expression, maybe you write about your experience, you spend some time in swimming in the river, enjoying nature, you know, like giving some time to the experience to settle down and to process it, share it some more with the person. Maybe you receive feedback from the facilitators or the shaman or psychologists during these sharing circles. And all that is fantastic. I mean, this needs to be done in my psychological perspective. If I would go to a Santo Daime session and they do this, that would look a little bit weird for me, you know. But in this other more Western context, I think that this is quite appropriate to do. And also facilitating some resources afterwards. This is also important to do. But what about the emergency or the integration for adverse effects? What I see the most in my daily practice is that people that have challenges after the experience is because there was a lack of preparation or a lack of screening. And usually it's not one or another, it's mostly four of them, you know, these four categories that happen at the same time. So no preparation. The session is really difficult, and maybe it was not in the safest or with the most experienced people. And the experience is traumatic, it's a challenging experience. And it can also be, this is a different category, someone that drinks ayahuasca very, very often, and all of a sudden they start kind of, let's say, losing contact with consensual reality, and the anxiety or the worries that they are experiencing are not because what happens in their daily life, but what happens in the experiences. Like, I don't know, I'm getting into these astral kind of experiences in which I travel to a place in which there are entities or whatever, and then the main anxiety is about that, you know, of this new cosmovision that they develop in their life. And all these situations, they usually manifest with a lot of anxiety, a lot of insomnia, panic attacks, the feeling of depersonalization, derealization, depression, and it's no joke. I mean, when this happens, it's something that can actually stay. You know, if it's not dealt, I would say, in the first week or 2 weeks, it's something that I've seen people 1 year afterwards still in this kind of situation. You know, people that contact us 6 months down the line. I went to a retreat in Peru 3 months ago, 6 months ago, and I'm still experiencing flashbacks, and I have difficulty to sleep. I cannot have the lights off. You know, I need lights all the time because I have the feeling that I'm gonna die or lose control or have a panic attack if I turn the lights off. And as you can see, this situation usually needs to be dealt by someone that knows a little bit of psychotherapy. It's not the traditional kind of integration. I mean, talking about the experience, sharing about the experience can be okay, but you need to do something else. So this would be like a more clinical approach, more and at the beginning it's more symptom based. You know, the idea here is that one needs to reduce the symptoms. You need to recover a certain stability in the life, like less anxiety, that you can sleep at night, that you can go back to work, that you can manage your schedule, and then comes the time to work about the content of the experience. But a lot of people sometimes don't want to work on the content of the experience. So this is a general overview of all these, the way that I understand the ayahuasca intake as a process, and the complexities of every single aspect of this process. You know, and so I think that in order to develop safer practices, being aware of this process, that is already a safer practice. Like knowing that it's not a thing of 6 hours, it's more something of weeks or months, you know. And then if you put it in this framework, then it becomes easier to deal with that, because you, as with the dieta, no, you're preparing for the experience, and you know that after the experience maybe you will have to do something else, you know. So this puts you in a situation in which it's not like a one-shot thing. It's more like, okay, I will do ayahuasca, but because there is something that I'm setting ahead in my future, and after that more things are going to happen, you know. So we join the experience with our daily life, what we do before and what we do afterwards. And I'm gonna leave it here. If you want to contact the ICER Integration and Support Service, here you have the website. You have my email here. I'll be happy to receive your emails. And I wanted to show you also a couple of resources that you can find on the website. Let me share with you. Okay, I'm gonna share something else. So I think that you can see now a website, right? So if you go to the Google and you write ayahuasca good practice guide, you're gonna find this. And then this is a compilation of what things that we believe are good practices. And this is a good summary, like something about screening. This is old. It has like 3-4 years, so it's not updated to what I've said today, but it's all right. And then some things before the session, during the session, after the session, and you will also find an informed consent and an example of a medical form that can be useful for a easy kind of screening. And if you go to the Ayahuasca Defense Fund, there's a website, there's a place in which there are the support criteria, which is based in a document that we created some years ago that's called the Hippocratic Oath. So it's based on similar to the medical Hippocratic Oath, you know, like which values should a practitioner have in order to practice ayahuasca medicine. And you can have a look at that and also give some ideas on safe practices. So thank you very much. And that's it from my part.
Hello, Marc. Thank you for your wonderful presentation. It keeps me fascinating and surprising how many resources ICERS has accumulated throughout the years. I mean, I collaborate closely with ICERS for at least 4 years or so, and I'm always impressed to find out how many things have been done and how many things are already in place. So we'll definitely be posting on our blog to make it more accessible, the Ayahuasca Good Practices and the Hippocratic Oath. I'm also getting a few questions about whether people could have access to the PowerPoint. I'd like to say that all the webinars are recorded, so this will be posted in our YouTube of the ADF, and I invite you all to join our newsletter. Before we go to the questions and answers, I just want to make 2 short comments myself about what Marc said. And I think one is this great founding paradox that the relationship between who needs to take ayahuasca and has problems versus who should be entitled and is able to drink ayahuasca. So that's a kind of paradox or catch-22, because the fact is that a lot of people that have severe mental health issues or addiction problems, mood disorders, have searched for different forms of healing and have not been able to find healing. And a lot of these people are driven to ayahuasca practices, like we say in Portuguese, like honey's like bees to honey. They kind of flow into ayahuasca sessions, and it's a little bit of a challenge to select who can and who cannot participate, because some of these people might get healed, but some maybe don't get healed. So there's been lots of discussions throughout the years. I just think that's a very interesting point. Maybe Marc could comment more on it afterwards. The second point I want to make is that, well, I found it totally mind-blowing and interesting and fascinating, this information about social need here. I didn't know that word, and I don't know if this has been published or not. But as an anthropologist, this really strikes my mind, some kind of more like scientific language to an idea that is very present in indigenous traditional communities. The idea that if you don't belong to any kinship, or if you refuse social interaction, that's the kind of worst attitude somebody could have towards the larger group. It's worse than being aggressive or being violent. It's a kind of refusal to social interaction. Especially, there's lots of discussions about, for example, there's a classic paper about orphans and how they could be considered dangerous or turn into jaguars if they don't belong to any kind of social network. So I thought that was very interesting, as this would be like the only universal sort of danger to joining ayahuasca sessions. That was new. And I also want to say that I don't know what Marc's next steps are, and I was very pleased to find out that he is an engineer, so or has engineering training. I think that's a very fabulous mix of psychology, engineering, and ayahuasca. That's definitely a great CV. And I just want to encourage you, Marc, to make a paper out of this. I don't know if you've been creating data on all the cases you have, but I think if you start to have all these phone calls you get and try to organize this information, I think this could be beyond a PowerPoint and a webinar. It could be a fantastic paper for journal in psychology, kind of making a typology of all problems and maybe correlations between elements, like you say, lack of preparation or lack of certain screening and consequences. I think I just want to tell our viewers that I modestly think that this is just a really incredible work that has not been done elsewhere too much, and this years and data that piles up brings us incredible first-hand knowledge and experience about what's going on in the expansion of ayahuasca. In this sense, I think this is a really unique opportunity, and I thank again both speakers. And I would like to make the first question to Jero. Somebody's asking here, what can we do about problematic practitioners that don't have a lot of ethical guidelines and that have proven to have problematic behaviors, and that sometimes have gone around and announcing sessions, doing exactly what you say you recommended as a basic etiquette, which is not do proselytism. And how can we as a community deal with those cases? And I know this is a hard one, Jero, but I trust you come up with something.
Yeah, that's very much the $1,000,000 question. One of the $1,000,000 questions. I think, and I really don't have an answer for this. I think the situation arises because of a lack of community, and the solution would be more community in the sense that if this information simply flew, I had a friend in a completely unrelated environment. So he's a business designer, but he used to say that advertising is the tax that the irrelevant have to pay. That means, and that applies very much to this. That means that if you good doctors and good healers, they don't need advertisement. And if you know a good chiropractor, you will know, and if you know a very good chiropractor, you will, or a very good acupuncturist, you will know that their office is always full. They don't need to go out and put ads. Ads is a sort of a tax. It's something that has to do when you're not, when you can rely on reputation. That is the reputation that your own work carries. I think one of the big problems with problematic practitioners is that the community believes that if we go out and sort of wash our dirty laundry in public, we will be damaging. We might stop this problematic practitioner, but we'll also be damaging the public image of ayahuasca. We're all at a place where we believe that part of the work that we have to do every day is to try to keep the good name of ayahuasca clean and good out in the public. And here's a lot of the work that Aixalà does, and a lot of the work all of us that are committed to these plants do. For this same reason, we believe that if we went out and publicly began to say that such and such person is doing things that are wrong or dangerous or whatever, that this might not just stop this person, but we might be feeding the fire of prohibition. We might be giving the kind of people who are the enemies of these substances good and better reasons to continue to criticize them. And that's the reason that holds us back from doing something that in other situations when prohibition is not an issue, are not an issue at all. In every other world, bad practitioners of anything, they simply get publicly exposed, and that's the end of it. Nobody believes that a bad driver gives cars a bad name. So I would say that really the only solution and the way also it works in these other communities is you can call it but you can also call it gossip. It's the fact that this information needs to get out, and it needs to spread. And at the same time, if it spreads, it does become sort of a potential weapon in the hands of another group of people. So, so that's really the conundrum. I don't think it's fully. I don't think anybody has fully solved it beyond that point. And that's all I can say.
Thank you, Jero.
1 second.
Thank you, Jero. And I just want to tell the viewers that Jero is part also of another institution called Plantaforma that is also based in Spain. And they also have a resourceful website, and they have been dealing with some of these challenging cases that emerged throughout the years, and I very much recommend you check their site. And the next question goes to Marc, and it's along those lines of my comment. People are asking here, don't you think that people with severe or some kind of mental health issue could really benefit from ayahuasca experience? And how do you deal with people that write lies in the screening forms because they don't want to be screened out and they want to participate, but in fact they write lies, and sometimes in the future you find out that that was a lie. So how do you deal with those things?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question, and I'm aware that when I was talking about the screening, it was like a very medical kind of approach. But we need to think that in the 60s and 70s, when LSD was legal, for example, it was being used to treat people with bipolar disorder, with schizophrenia, with really severe mental illnesses. And it worked, So it is not that ayahuasca or any other mind-altering substance or plant cannot be beneficial for mental illnesses. I think the importance of a screening is not for the person, it's for the practitioner, the screening. So the basic question in screening is, am I able to support this person in the way that he or she needs? I mean, maybe someone with severe depression can really benefit from ayahuasca, but maybe the kind of context of ayahuasca workshop that you're offering is not the suitable for this person. So I'm going to give you a personal example. I lead holotropic breathwork workshops, and we do this kind of screening. And there's sometimes people for which it seems that holotropic breathwork is not the good technique to do at that moment because they are in an unstable moment of their life, or they have had, I don't know, a manic episode recently or whatever. And then it's not that holotropic breathwork cannot help these people. Is that in one-day workshop, the framework that I provide, I am not able to provide the support that this person needs. You know, if I would have a 24-hour clinic 7 days a week with 3 shifts of personnel that is trained, then we could do everything, you know, but the screening has to be adequate to the setting that you offer, you know, so it needs to be coherent with what you do. So of course that a lot of people with psychological or physical difficult conditions will come and ask for healing with ayahuasca, with breathwork, with MDMA, with whatever, you know, and if we are very strict with screening, then what are we saying? That we need like healthy people to take a medicine? That makes no sense, because these are healing tools also, you know. So it's a compromise between the needs of the person and what the workshop and what the context can offer, and that's all what the screening is about, in my opinion, you know. So if you are Stan Grof and you have the hospital in Johns Hopkins University at your disposal to do treatments 7 days a week, then you can probably be much lighter on screening. You can take everyone. But if you do a weekend workshop with ayahuasca and you have only 1 assistant and 40 participants, maybe you cannot, your screening needs to be much tighter, you know. So that will depend on you for sure. And the second question was, what happens if they lie? Well, the idea is that to be honest about that, you know, you're doing the screening to offer the safest possibility for this for the participants, you know. So if the screening is as complex as the one as I described, with all these questionnaires and all that, people are going to lie, you know. But if you make it a little bit more simple and you do an interview and you have some skills in doing interviews, and you know what questions you can write and questions you can ask, you know, and then to get the general feeling of the person and establish a relationship with the person. Because in the end, the most important thing when dealing with non-ordinary states of consciousness is that the person that is going to participate in the workshop can trust you or not. You know, if you cannot trust the facilitator or the shaman, then it's better not to do that. And this is something that you will see in the interview. Am I able to establish a trusting relationship with this person? If the question is no, maybe you need to think if that's the appropriate way to go to continue offering the workshop to this person. So, but this will happen, you know. It has happened to me several times in breathwork, you know, which it seems like a lighter thing, but people lying in the medical form and then in the interview telling you know what, I was diagnosed bipolar 6 years ago, and then the people is already in the workshop, and what do you do with that? Well, good luck. It's not an easy situation. What is important is that if you discover that someone cannot participate in the context that you offer, to offer an alternative, you know, not to say, no, you cannot do it, goodbye. That is not taking care of people that are already in your workshop. It's like, okay, I don't think that you're in the moment of drinking ayahuasca, doing breathwork, whatever, but maybe you could do this and that. You offer some other resources. And I think that this is the most honest and careful way to do that.
I would like to just to follow up on this thing that Marc was saying, which I think is very interesting. I've one of the places, the many places that I visited is a detox center in the Peruvian Amazon where they do precisely this. I mean, if you look at the list at their patients, they fulfill most of the things that Marc has described as the people that you should probably screen out. They have them all. There are people who have, like, you know, addiction problems, deep addiction problems. They're the kind of people that have very strong and sometimes very bad reactions to these plants. But they are on a 24-hour shift. They're staying there for 9 months. And I would also add that the rules, the contention rules about what can be done and cannot be done, and how things are run, and things like dieta are more strict there than possibly any other place that I've ever visited in the world of ayahuasca. And the reason is because they're dealing with people who are such, you know, so the potential for all sorts of reactions is so large that absolutely all of the factors that can be contained and controlled are contained in control. So it is indeed it is indeed possible, and this is the people that need it the most. But these are, as Marc said, the people that need the most elaborate context of support around
them. Thank you both again. I also want to make a remark that we had originally thought when we would do this this webinar whether we wanted to focus something more for the practitioners or something more for the people who hold the ceremonies or the people that join the ceremonies, and we kind of decided to make a balance. But I think that Marc's answer is also great, because he's saying the screening is not only the screening of the participants, but is the screening of oneself, the screening of those who are giving out the medicine. And I think that's an important element to add to the discussion, because it's a process that has a road that has two sides. It's not just the people that participate, but the people that are engaging in these activities to think about their own potentials. And I think that, again, underlying word that I see from both what Jero and Marc are saying, their contributions, it seems to be the word relationship. When Marc says that, you know, it's better for you to establish a relationship and talk to the person and create a connection than to have this person feel out of form. Most likely, if you engage in a kind of personal relationship, the person will have less chances to lie than if you're just giving her a bureaucratic form. And again, coming back to the story of social isolation, and coming back to Jero's answer about what to do with problematic practitioners. And he's saying, you know, that we need more community, we need more information, we need more connectedness. So I think both answers in different regards bring out those words relationship and connectedness, connection, exchange. And this is a little bit what we are trying to do with our webinars, is to create these networks and to establish relationships and to create community. So I would like to invite all of you to join our efforts. This is very much an initial kind of, you know, filling in the dark sort of attempt to create these connections and these communities. It's a free donation from us to the world, and we very much are building this and accept feedback, and would enjoy that you participate more actively in with your expertise, with your time, with money, or with whatever means you feel you can add. And to conclude, there is one question for both participants. Did you ever have a challenging experience with ayahuasca? Can you share? What did you do and how did you get out of it? And did that help you be here telling us about what to do? Do you need to go through a bad one to have some kind of wisdom to give tips about it? Or do you care to open up a little bit about that? I'll go back first to Jero and then Marc.
Trying to get my screen here. Yes, I've had many challenging experiences with ayahuasca. As a matter of fact, I've had so many challenging experiences with ayahuasca that this past summer, as I went back to a place I often visit, and I proceeded to have yet another challenging experience with ayahuasca, and I described it to the person who was running the session, who was also a psychologist. And he said, you know, it's not unheard of. I mean, I've heard of other people having, you know, similarly difficult experiences as what you described. What I don't know anybody that keeps having experiences like this and keeps drinking ayahuasca for 15 years. So can you, you know, have you ever actually thought about asking ayahuasca, what is it exactly that you get out of this experience? you know, because what I don't see is people having these experiences and going back to drink again. So then the next time that I drank ayahuasca, you know, I asked ayahuasca this question. I asked ayahuasca, like, you know, just exactly what is it that I get? And here I'm talking about, there were not necessarily things that were hard to integrate, but just very difficult nights with very alarming physical, just variety of physical symptoms, but, you know, sort of painful and alarming. And I asked ayahuasca, you know, just what is it? Why do I keep coming back if this is so difficult? And the answer was sort of, it had to do with the fact, I think, you know, and this is a purely personal thing. I'm a very mental person. I'm a very intellectual person. I tend to digest everything through my head. I question and filter most of my impulses, feelings, emotions, etc., reactions, and then what the plants give me, and I include ayahuasca in a battery of plants that are in vegetalismo. There's also very strong purgative plants. There's dieta plants. What the plants give me is that the plants really overpower you. There's a moment where you know, and for me personally, that I've been such measure and control person, this has turned out to be quite an important lesson, and something that I keep returning to, even though, like I say, there's certainly a price of in difficulty. So yeah, I mean, I don't know how good an answer that is. I don't know if it makes sense, but I'll pass the baton to Marc.
Yeah, I've also had challenging experience with ayahuasca. I was trying to count, and I think that I've had 2 of them that were not challenging, but I think ayahuasca, for me at least, always has this point of a challenge in the kind of experience it provides. But I've had one in the ayahuasca conference in Brazil, in a Santo Daime celebration. I'm gonna skip the details, but it became kind of known for a lot of people at that conference. So it was quite a dramatic session for me. And the good thing is that after that, I didn't experience what I see some people experiencing, like anxiety and insomnia, and these kind of things that I was telling you about. I was scared about the experience that I had. I didn't really understand what happened. It was like something unknown opened for me, and I was scared to drink again. You know, like, what is going to happen? What if it happens again? I think that it does help to know that experiences can get challenging, in order to be more compassionate to someone that lives in my practice. And I've had a lot of challenging experiences with psychedelics, but that, in a way, I think that helps me to be more compassionate and more and not to rush things. You know, sometimes it seems that the way out of these kind of experiences has to be fast and easy, but it takes time. So, and also it make me think that it doesn't really depend on what I do as a therapist. You know, there is a process, and I can accompany the person in that process. I can be helpful in that process, but in a way to trust also the process. You know, I've come out of my challenging experiences, I would say, stronger is not the good word, you know, but more complete than if I had not gone through those experiences. So I assume that this can be also something that happens to other people, and then my role there is to facilitate that to happen. So, yeah.
Oops. Wait.
Challenging. Thank you again. And I want to say that I also had my share of challenging experiences. And I think, you know, for one thing, if as we were talking here with some friends lately, if you want to work with this topic, I find that if you have, if you haven't vomited enough and haven't been humbled enough on your knees, kind of having experiences, maybe you don't have the humbleness necessary to do the work. So one thing I think that this compassion of suffering and that learning with those experiences do, I hope, make us better advocates for working with ayahuasca. And I think this webinar synthesizes a little bit the spirit of what we're trying to get with the ADF, which is a combination of scientific knowledge, firsthand experience, and compassion and community building. So thank you all for watching us, and come back and join us for the next webinar on June 14 about ayahuasca legal implications globally. Thank you, and see you on the next one.